Hey, grade eights. It's me, Mr. Hansen here,
And
with
I'm
the
Mr. Young.
with the wonderful Mr. Yeoman. Forgive me for not having my camera on today. I'm kind of doing the recording. Can't really have the camera. I'm using my actual computer this time. And today, grade eights, we are looking at the Meiji period of Japan, which basically had Japan changing from an isolated feudal nation to an industrial powerhouse in like a span of less than 60 years. And a lot of it had to do with this man right here, Emperor Meiji.
Right. So when we talk about grade eight curriculum, we're talking about what happens when two different cultures come in contact with each other and the change that comes out of that. Right. And so in our last chapter, we looked at isolation in Japan and their policies of how they became isolated and what life was like in Japan over the 200-year or so period of the Tokugawa shogunate. Okay. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at how the Tokugawa shogunate comes to an end and how the Meiji period. So we were looking at the Edo period, and now we're transitioning to the Meiji period. So first we look at this guy here, Commodore Perry. Okay, so in our other chapters we talked about the age of exploration, how the Europeans went out around the world looking for all sorts of goods, looking for gold and silver, looking to spread their religion. Okay, now one of the things the Europeans did bring went to North America, and eventually the United States emerged out of that, right? We remember that the United States used to be British colonies, okay? But by the 1800s, the United States itself has become powerful enough that they too want to get in the game of creating colonies around the world, or at least going out and building trading relationships with countries around the world, okay? And so by the middle 1800s, the United States has grown into a global power on the same level as Great Britain and other European powers. And the US goes looking for colonies of their own. They sail across the Pacific Ocean, and they make contact with Japan. Commodore Perry was the leader of this expedition of Japan. Okay, now when they reached there in 1853, I believe, when they reach Japan, Japan is highly isolated and resistant to the United States arrival.
Yeah. So Commodore Perry and his fleet arrive, and it's kind of funny because this is our first time we actually get to see America as a power. I mean, last year in grade 7 we did talk about the United States, especially right around when Canada was becoming a confederation. So it's kind of nice to see our friends the Americans coming back in. And I'll be honest with you guys, they kind of acted like bullies. Okay, they were kind of flexing their military might to force the Japanese people into signing a treaty with them. It wasn't so much like they were going to declare war on Japan, but they made an effort to show that, hey, if you don't sign with us, it could get ugly. So why do they decide to open up after 250 years? Like I said, the ships themselves were on a whole new level that the Japanese had never seen. Okay, and they got straight up intimidated by them. Okay, these were like little wood ships compared to these juggernauts that the Americans had. Also, the Japan knew about what happened in China when the British made contact with the Chinese people, and the British used quite a bit of force to coerce the Chinese to work with them. Japan really didn't want to go down that road too. Also, another thing that wasn't really helping matters was that the shogun was in a bit of a mess right now because after Perry left, the shogun in charge shortly died afterwards, and his son was put in charge, but unfortunately his son was very sickly and very weak, and he was still a child. So leadership was definitely going under construction. And also, there was a lot of tensions happening in Japan at the moment, and it was going to be basically coming to a boiling point.
So disorder and civil war. So eventually the shogun decides to sign treaties with the U.S., creating a trading relationship. Many Japanese saw this as evidence that the shogun was weak. This led to a lot of civil unrest, which means like riots, and basically a civil war breaks out across Japan, with many of the daimyo opposed to the current Tokugawa shogun. Okay, many daimyo and samurai. So then the shogun has to try to establish or hold on to its power, the shogunate. And so many of the daimyo and samurai were in prison, they were exiled, even executed. okay, which just causes the problem to spiral further out of control. Attacks on foreigners increased, and at times American gunboats bombed the Japanese shore in response. Right, so the country is in chaos, and even the American ships are bombing the shoreline to try to calm the disorder. Finally, in 1868, the shogun, realizing that he can no longer hold on to power, resigns, and the emperor Meiji regained power of Japan. And so, just to add that, right, the emperor always existed in Japan, we know, but the emperor traditionally didn't hold any power, right? And so, what's happening here is the emperor is retaking power of the country.
And of course, the emperor that we're talking about is Emperor Meiji, who is basically the center focus of this whole era. Heck, this whole era is named after him too. So when Prince Mutishito, I probably butchered that name, I am so sorry, was made emperor when he was a teenager. He was actually around your guys' age when he became emperor of Japan. So just put that in context. While you guys are like trying to decide what Snapchat filter to use, this guy's leading an entire nation. Okay. He selected the name Meiji because it meant enlightened rule. So this was a period in which he came to the throne and restored power to the emperor. Like Mr. Yeoman said, the emperor was more like you're important. You look at you go, descendant of God. We're gonna make sure that we control the country. The emperor was no longer being a figurehead. He was taking like direct control over Japan. His reign lasted for many years and was known as the Meiji period and is famous as a time of major reform across Japan. Like I said earlier, Japan would transform itself from a very isolated state that was very far behind technologically to a powerhouse by the time the Meiji emperor unfortunately passed away. Also worth noting here is looking at the emperor's clothes. And no, I'm not really a big fashion guy here, but it's very fascinating because when you look at his attire, it is not the traditional Japanese attire. It is very influenced by the European tradition. So it's like taking the best of both worlds. You have the Japanese tradition and European innovation to create something new.
So, what does this restoration of the emperor look like? Okay, so there's new ideas about government. The samurai who led the fight to restore the emperor to power became his top advisors and would go on to become very wealthy and powerful in Japan. They were known as the oligarchy, or an unelected group of powerful leaders. These leaders realized that if Japan wanted to remain independent from other global powers, like the European powers in the United States, they would need to industrialize the military and the economy. Basically, when we think of Japan, it's been isolated for 250 years. And in that time period, there's been a lot of changes around the world. And the Japanese have fallen far behind the rest of the world. And so these leaders in Japan realize that they need to rapidly catch up to the rest of the world. So they create a strong central government, which included an element of democracy. If you were a landowner or whatnot, you could take part in the government. And they moved the emperor from Kyoto to the power center of the country, which was in Tokyo.
So, continuing on the theme of new ideas for government, the emperor forced the daimyo across Japan to turn over their land to the state. So, no longer was it that the daimyo were going to own the land. This was, again, more of having that centralized power with the emperor in charge. They would be compensated, but their power was basically over. So they would be getting some money for this, but like I said, their power, gone. Also, now that the daimyo are taken care of, the samurai system was basically over. It was very outdated, and that means that the samurai would actually have to be forced and get a real job. Also, with the centralization of power and having the daimyo turn over their land, the feudal system was ended. Now, you guys should know what feudalism is by now. I'm not going to be going into too much detail. And basically, only the government would have the power to collect taxes and enforce laws. This was great news for the peasant class because now they were free to move wherever they want on the land, and they could actually become owners of the land on which they live. This type of freedom was not available during the shogunate period. Remember, during the shogunate period, you had 250 years of very rigid rules, including very limited mobility period and social mobility, so being able to move up the ranks socially was unheard of. So this was some pretty big changes for Japan. And you have to remember, this was 250 years of having these strict rules and these strict systems, and now there's more freedom.
Right, and so just to add to that, I mean, for certain daimyo and certain samurai, this change was bad because they were losing their power. Their whole way of life was coming to an end. But for many others, for the majority of people in Japan, most people were peasants, right? And so for the peasants, this is great news. They have way more freedoms now. They own their own land now. They don't have to rigidly serve their daimyo, right? So Japan is here in the process of becoming a modern nation state, much like Canada or the United States was at the time. So we're looking at the other thing they wanted to do. So they became a modern nation state with a national government. They also wanted to industrialize. So in the 1700s, Europe and North America began industrializing, which meant that the economy shifted from one of primarily farming to one of manufacturing. Basically, new technology came along that made it easy to mass produce goods, okay? Which meant many people moved from working on farms to working in factories, okay? This process in the West took over 100 years, though. This didn't happen overnight. Well, in Japan, because they're so far behind the West, they're going to try to rapidly industrialize. They're going to industrialize over a much shorter period of time. And so in order to do that, they're going to need help.
Yeah, so basically the Japanese, they actually hired experts outside of their country who were well in tune with industrialization to help them develop that technology, which included the building of factories, creating a national military, and also building rail lines across the country. Not unlike what was going on in Canada at this time. And like Mr. Yeoman alluded to, the Japanese would be doing this over a way quicker amount of time, which is quite staggering. Japanese representatives also visited places in the West to learn more about construction, medicine, military sciences, and shipbuilding. This is huge. This is basically the complete opposite of the shogunate era, where the shogun would keep tabs so he knew what was going on. Now it's more about like welcoming these changes so that they can play catch up. Also, major industries were created out of basically nothing and paid for by the government, eventually turned over to the oligarchs. And these Japanese family firms would become very powerful businesses in Japan.
Right, so when we talk about that, we mean like the owners of these factories that produce all sorts of goods, the owners of the rail lines, the owners of the steel manufacturers, coal power, and all that. These oligarchs who helped the emperor come to power, they would basically be given these companies, and they would be powerful, wealthy people in Japan for the next 100 years. Some of them still exist. Some of them still have this power today. And so that basically concludes our lecture here on the Meiji period. Now, the Emperor Meiji would reign until 1912, I believe.
Yep.
Okay, so for a period of about, what is that? 40 years, more than 40, almost 45 years.
Yeah, I would say about like 50-ish.
Yeah. So it would be a long time for this Meiji period. And in this short period of time, I mean, 40 years might sound like a long time, but it's actually quite short in the sense of how rapidly and how greatly the country was changed in that time period. And really would create the modern Japan that we know today.
Yep, and with that said, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed our lecture today on the Meiji era and the Meiji period, looking at the transformation of Japan into what they are today. Basically, set the foundation moving forward.